Can I welcome everybody and all of those of you online for joining this inaugural lecture. Just a few housekeeping matters before we start. My name is Caroline Jackson, by the way. I'm head of department. For those of you in the lecture theatre, in the event of a fire, follow the emergency signs and assemble in St George's Churchyard, so it's just a church in that direction. Please keep your masks on during the lecture and maintain 2 meters distancing. When the lecture ends, please leave a row at a time. I don't think that's going to be too difficult, but I'll tell you when to leave, okay? There's no social space, so you'll have to go straight outside afterwards. The question and answer session after the lecture will take place via Mentimeter. So I'll be facilitated, I think, with that. So you put your questions in through your phone. So in-person and online questions. And you've been emailed a link to submit your questions. Right. I will now like to introduce Umberto. First of all, again, thank you for attending for those of you online, and I know many of you are listening and will really want to engage with this lecture, and so we'll do the best we can to help you along with that. My name's Caroline Jackson. I'm the current head of Department of Archaeology in Sheffield, and it's my greatest pleasure to introduce Umberto's inaugural lecture. Inaugural lectures acknowledge the promotion to Professor, the highest academic rank. Umberto Albarella was born in Naples, and his formative education was in Italy. He graduated with an excellent laureate, equivalent to a BSc, MSc, from the University of Naples in 1986, with a dissertation on relationships between people and animal resources, a subdisciplinary area which would form the core of his future research specialisms. I won't try and massacre the Italian of what your thesis was, Umberto. He continued his archaeological career and his passion in zooarchaeology, working as a zooarchaeologist on the Ubir project, studying the archaeological monuments and finds retrieved from excavations in Naples and the Phlegrean fields, and in the early 1990s gained a position at the University of Lecce, teaching bioarchaeology. Umberto then made his move to the UK, taking up a role as a research officer for the study of animal bones from archaeological sites with the Ancient Monuments Laboratory of English Heritage, London, and then later at the University of Birmingham as a research fellow in zooarchaeology, a post again funded by English Heritage until 2000. Here he taught environmental archaeology and developed the laboratory for the study of animal bones, liaising with commercial sectors to facilitate building the laboratory and for training students. This gave him a firm grounding and research expertise in a number of different environments, which have laid, again, the foundation of his later career. From the early 2000s, Umberto studied for a PhD at Durham University within his role as a senior research associate, completing this in 2005 on the topic of the archaeology of pig domestication and husbandry, a clue to this afternoon's lecture. He also taught during this PhD, gaining further experience in a variety of archaeological fields, including his own in animal bones and human societies. Now to the Sheffield stage of Umberto's career. He joined Sheffield as a research officer in zooarchaeology in 2004. Here he joined colleagues in archaeobotany and zooarchaeology to grow this area. He continued to build the animal bone teaching collection, already in progress, still liaising with English Heritage and continuing his consultation in addition to teaching and supervision. Throughout his continuous involvement with archaeological units, he has collaborated continuously between the commercial and academic worlds. He was promoted to Senior Research Officer in 2009, then to senior lecturer in 2010, reader in 2014, and professor in 2019. I think a rapid rise in his career, which is mirrored in his research. Umberto's research areas are extensive, but animal domestication and husbandry intensification in Europe have been a major research priority for him for more than 30 years. The species he has concentrated on most is the pig, using aging and biometry techniques, but also genetics and isotopic analysis. He also researches ritual use of animals, the Zooarchaeology of Britain, some of which has been published in a recent monograph on Central England, Ethno archaeology, especially in Sardinia and Corsica, on husbandry practices, and husbandry evidence of Romanization. His research emphasizes interdisciplinary and the integration of disciplines inside and outside of archaeology, for instance, history, ethnography, biochemistry, and genetics. His research projects have received ample publicity. Prominent among these is the Feeding Stonehenge project, seen on TV and featured in the press, and his related work on the animal remains from Durrington Wars, which has been featured prominently in Science, the journal, in 2014 and on Channel 5. Umberto has more than 100 publications, including 5 monographs, 6 edited books. He was a series editor for 14 books following an International Council of Archaeozoology conference, and has papers in renowned international journals, such as the Journal of Archaeological Science, the Journal of World Prehistory, +1, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He was commissioned to edit and write the introductory section for the Oxford Handbook of Zooarchaeology, which appeared in 2018. While in Sheffield, Umberto has continued to build his research laboratory, not just populating the animal bone collection, but expanding it with high quality and energetic researchers from PhD students, 15 of which have completed in this short time, postdoctoral researchers, including 4 Marie Curie ITN awards, amongst other postdoctoral grants, and to visiting collaborators. Some of you may be here now or watching online. He's also run some highly successful short professional development courses with his team and brings in students from a wide variety of backgrounds to study in Sheffield. And he has also presented his research to schools and community groups and local museums and local societies. And he's an active member of many learned societies, particularly as General Secretariat of the International Council of Archaeozoology until 2012, and he's now on the Committee of Honour. Also the European Association of Archaeologists, and amongst others, Archaeologists for Global Justice, which he founded. The quality of his teaching is attested by the constantly enthusiastic feedback received from students, especially on his MSc in osteoarchaeology. He's been nominated twice for the Students' Union Excellence in Teaching Awards and Staff Student Committee Coordinator of the Year. He cares greatly for his students and his co-workers. You can see Umberto's career has been one of prestige and great success. However, I might suspect, if you ask him, Umberto will say his greatest achievement, or perhaps joy, is his family. And I think that says such a lot about Umberto's approach to his teaching and research. All his past and current students, and his postdoctoral students, and the researchers, collaborators, and colleagues are wrapped up by Umberto as part of his family, and remain so. One final word, perhaps, before I introduce Umberto's inaugural lecture. You will be aware that this inaugural lecture from Umberto is a bittersweet moment for all of us, as our department is threatened with closure after more than 50 years of successful teaching and research, and staff are facing redundancy. This may therefore be the last inaugural lecture from the Department of Archaeology in Sheffield. And we would like to thank you all for your support, not only for attending this lecture, which was already at online capacity some weeks ago, but also for your fantastic support for our department over the last few weeks and for helping with our campaign to save the department, which Umberto has become the public face of. So, it is with the greatest pleasure I introduce Umberto, who will now speak on a topic which has a certain resonance for us in the department today. Life is a pig. Animals, archaeology, and social justice. Thank you. Umberto.
Right, hello, and well, first of all, many thanks to Caroline for this very nice introduction. I was almost about to cry, but I managed to hold it. Thank you very much for all the people who are here, all people who are very dear to my heart, and also to all the people who are attending remotely. It's one of these opportunities that COVID has given us to have this context, from distance. It's not quite as nice as to see people in the flesh, but it's better than nothing. I also would like to thank the people who have helped to organize this session, and Alex, Sarah, and Kerry is not here. So I'm very grateful for all your effort. As Caroline said, that this inaugural lecture happens at a very strange time. My professorship was 2.5 years ago, so this is a bit delayed. Obviously, COVID has played havoc with everybody's life. And this delay has also led to the fact that this is coinciding very oddly with the fact that we are celebrating my professorship in my chair, and at the same time, I may actually be announcing my redundancy soon. This is a little bit odd, and it puts me in a very strange position and almost unique position, very special. And in some respect, I suppose I do need to thank the University Executive Board for putting me in this very special and unique position. But let's move on to the subject, to my lecture, which is Life is a Pig, Animals, Archaeology, and Social Justice. Okay. Yes, okay. As Caroline said, my specialization is in zooarchaeology, okay? I know that there are some people who are not here, who actually are not archaeologists who are following us. So I just wanted to clarify what I do. Basically, I study the past relationship between people and animals. And in particular, I study the material remains of the animals, as archaeologists do. This is what we do as archaeology. We study the material remains of our past. And I'm interested in all kinds of animals, and as you can see from this photograph, I'm also a rather competent donkey rider. But in addition to that, I think the pig has always played a central role to my research. And the reason why I decided to talk about pigs today, there are a number of reasons that probably I should explain. One of them is that it is unquestionably one of the most important animals in human history. Okay. Obviously, pigs are everywhere nowadays. They contribute to so many aspects of our development as a human society. The other thing is a personal one for a number of reasons that are partly coincidental, partly all my choice, is one of the species I have studied most extensively. But perhaps the most important of all is it's an animal for which I feel a natural affinity. The reason for that is because the pig is an animal that is often really not very highly regarded. Sometimes placed almost at the margins of the animal world. And not always, to talk of pigs doesn't always bring, positive elements, positive vibes, let's put it in this way. And since I was a child, I have always had this very strong attraction towards people and sympathy towards people who lived at the margins of society, and feeling a strong sense of solidarity for people who were oppressed. And I think in some respects, pigs have been oppressed. And it is why they have played such an important role in my life. So I see them as symbols. The fact that the pigs, don't have this great image is perhaps associated, could be, summarized very easily with the fact that if you use the expression "you are a pig," everybody will know that this is not a compliment. Okay, and one of the big tragedies of my life is that nobody has ever said that to me. And the reason why it's a tragedy, because my answer would have been, thank you very much for associating me with such a noble and interesting animal. Okay, but it doesn't happen. But this is one way to look at it, and it is a very interesting and noble animal in my view. The other thing is that our conception of pigs is very kind of culturally dependent. It's culturally relative. In Papua New Guinea, it's not unusual for women to breastfeed piglets, as you can see in that image. And here you can see even a woman breastfeeding a child on one breast and a piglet on the other. Okay, so obviously you wouldn't do this to animals that you despise. Now, to avoid to romanticize this too much, I have to say that these pigs will end up being slaughtered. There is little question about the fact that the pigs do have an image problem, okay? And this is probably encapsulated by this pig that I'm showing you here, which is hugely overweight, and many people will not associate this pig with the concept of prettiness, okay? But if you think about it, this is a completely human-made phenomenon, okay? This is not how pigs should look like. This is how pig may become through some rather cruel process of selection generated by humans. And again, talking about the racial cultural relativism, I mean, in antiquity, wild boars were very much respected and admired, and actually the wild boar hunting was really only restricted to the bravest of all. Okay? And regarded really very much as noble animals and featuring very strongly in the classical mythology. Okay. I mean, one writer who I very much love, but who has some responsibility for this kind of bad name that pigs have, is obviously George Orwell. I mean, everybody will know about this absolutely stunning novel, which is one of my favorite books ever, Animal Farm, and the famous pigs who oppress all the other animals in the farm. But if you reflect on this, while before I showed you a pig which has kind of doesn't have a very nice image because of what people have done to them, in this case is what the author has done to pigs. The reason why we dislike these pigs is not because they act pig-like. We dislike them because they act human-like. And so if we manage to move ourselves from this view of pig and transform it to something else, actually pigs are really lovely animals. But because humans are what they are, and despite the great contribution that pigs have made to human history and to the development of our society, for which we should just be very grateful to pigs, actually one of the most horrific things that humans do nowadays, and they put animals into lagers, okay? As you can see them here, and living in terrible conditions, and perhaps the lack of sympathy towards pigs has helped this phenomenon. But one of the reasons why I think it's important to study animals in general, and pigs in particular, and also emphasize the important role that they have for our culture and for our societies, is because that helps in raising the respect that we have for these animals, okay? And when there is respect, it's much more difficult to be cruel towards these animals. You know, this is what has happened to humans towards other humans. It has become easier to oppress other human beings when you dehumanize them and you put, you know, you consider them as something inferior, something that is bad. And but when you start respecting the culture or other people and their backgrounds, and the same applies to animals, it's possible to move on from that. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to study the history of pigs. Where does my interest for pigs come from? Well, it really comes from the very beginning of my career. As Karen said before, I graduated at the University of Naples, and I was a student in natural science, not in archaeology. And this is my dissertation of the time, which translated from Italian is the relationship between people and animal resources for a theory of their fluctuations. I used to be a lot more theoretical than I am now. And this was supervised by Francesco Fedele, who is really the person who introduced me to the world of archaeology as a natural science student. The core subject of my dissertation is that basically I wanted to show that the evolution of the relationship between people and animals was not a linear one, something that nowadays most people will accept. But this is the mid-80s we are talking about, when there was sometimes a more kind of simplified approach to this, with this idea that the humans had their hunting past and they moved on towards farming and so on. But actually, I had put together lots of examples showing that actually hunting continued to play an important role even later on in the history of humans, when farming had become well known. The other thing that actually worried me is that this perception of this linear evolution actually was very much associated with racism too, okay, regarding societies that actually hadn't quite got there as backwards and inferior, okay. In terms of trying to assess the role that hunting had for this later society, however, as a zooarchaeologist, I had the technical problem that I had to understand whether the bones I found from archaeological sites were from wild animals or from domestic animals. Then, if I had to deal with something like red deer, which is a wild animal which has never been domesticated and relatively easy to identify, I didn't have a problem. But the problem arises when I had to try to figure out whether my bones came from domestic pigs or wild boar. And this is methodological problem that I had a very direct influence on my kind of grand scale historical interpretations. At the time, you know, this after the time of my dissertation, I got involved with many projects. One of them was actually to explore the hinterland and also the interior, the mountainous interior of my region. And I did this with a group of various friends. One of them was Franco De Matteis. You see here, this is a photo from the 80s when we were actually exploring the area. And one of the sites we really looked at very carefully was a site at Molino Sant'Antonio, which was a late Neolithic site that we ended up excavating. This is one of my very first publications, and actually it was a very formative publication for me, because after having completed my dissertation, the subject I have discussed, I was very interested to study the animal bones from this site, to find out that a late Neolithic site, where in many situations we would expect to find a great predominance of domestic animals, actually was rather dominated by wild animals. Okay, so this was one case where even in the late Neolithic, you had hunting still playing a very important role in human society. However, what you see here is that at this site there were plenty of deer, I mean, some sheep and goat, but even hare and bear were more common than cattle. But the most common animal of all was the pig. But as you can see here, I had the usual problem, how to distinguish the wild boar from the domestic pig. So that remains a methodological issue that I had to solve. Because I knew both were there, but in what way and how could I draw the line between the two remained one important concern for me. Something else happened in this period, which was very formative for me. In 1986, I visited for the first time Sardinia, the place for me, the place I love most in the world, okay? And I learned to love most in the world. And when I was visiting this absolutely magical plateau in central Sardinia, and I remember sitting near a church, which I'll show you in a minute, and out of the blue, I was surrounded by pigs, okay? And there was a very elderly swineherd with them. It's the very only time after, and in the future, after that, I would actually go back to Sardinia and study this phenomenon many times, and I never ever saw again the pigs with the swineherd. I've always seen the pigs alone. And in that particular case, there was a swineherd, and there were these amazing pigs running around, but they were this kind of pigs. Long snout, very agile. It's nothing to do with the classic image of the fat sty-pig that we may have had. That was very formative for me. This is the place I'm talking about. These are photographs for the mid-80s, so you will excuse me if they are not top quality. Maybe I'm also not a very good photographer. So I just thought, if I have to understand the archaeology, I really need to figure out the complexity of the relationship between people and pigs, and also the complexity and diversity of types of pigs that we have. Otherwise, those bones will not tell me anything. Okay, and so this is, I started a number of projects that went on for a number of years on this subject that we call ethnoarchaeology. What is ethnoarchaeology? Ethnoarchaeology is basically an ethnographic study, so a study of contemporary societies, but carried out having archaeological questions in mind. Okay, so this is what I did. And in the years that follow, there are many things I learned. You can see myself here on another plateau taking pictures of pigs, but I learned that pigs can run very fast. So mobility is a very important issue in archaeology, and you will see why in a minute. This pig here is a wild boar domestic pig hybrid. Okay, so the other thing to remember, the separation between the two species is not always very clear. I learned that fat can be good, okay? So this is one of the herders I interviewed, and with this ham here, you can see there is a lot of fat, but I can tell you it has a taste that I never experienced before or after. This was unbelievably delicious. It is good quality products with free-range pigs. The other thing is, one of the elements with pigs is that it's often said, also in archaeological interpretations, that pig cannot really live with crops because they destroy crops. But I experienced what I had read in the literature, which is, can you see this iron wire here inserted in the snout of the pigs? And basically, when you place that wire in the snout, as one of the herders told me, the pig grazes like a sheep. Okay, so there are ways to make the pigs live alongside crops. So there were lots of things I was learning. I have also, in the course of this lecture, I also wanted to acknowledge people who have really been important for my life and career. And one of them is that guy you can see there in the top corner, Filippo Manconi, a great friend of mine. He did a lot of this work with me, and he's from Sardinia, so I really was getting a lot of help from his local knowledge. Some of the work, my ethnographic work, has been published in these two books, which I have edited in the course of the years. And in particular, the second one, Ethno-Zooarchaeology, was co-edited with Angela Trentacoste. Angela is here. It's always very nice to see her. Okay. In the Sardinian landscape, I think it's one of the very few places in Europe where you can see free-range pigs pasturing together with horses. It's quite remarkable. And look at these pigs here. Look at the length of their legs. These pigs can really move a lot and move fast. That's important to consider. There is also, I don't like using ethnography to reconstruct models to apply to the past. I don't believe in it. You know, models are too complex. You never have situations that are similar. But what I believe in is that ethnographically, you can see examples of interactions, okay, which can be useful when you have type of archaeology evidence. One thing that was very interesting was a classic way for traditional Sardinian society to keep animals. So what they would do is that you see here there would be a plateau and the animals, and here I mentioned pigs, but it's not just pigs, there would be goats, cattle, horses, sheep, you name them, and donkeys, and they would stay put there in what is communal land, okay? The people who live in the village, but especially the men, on a regular basis, they would move, they would walk, okay, from the village to the plateau and spend some of the time there, okay? So this is what communal land does to you. This opens up this possibility. And then you can see that this lifestyle, what kind of implication it has for the organization of the society. And that kind of scenario that opens for us also for archaeological interpretations. So using communal land is very important. This hut that you see here, that man is Armando Maxia, a local, very good local Sardinian anthropologist who took me in this area. This hut is a classic hut that was used by shepherds in these plateaus. Incredibly, if you are inside those huts, and I have been inside many of the nuraghe, they look very similar. What are nuraghe? They are very famous Sardinian prehistoric monuments. Okay, from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age. I always find it fascinating that these huts actually followed in many respects the construction techniques of the nuraghe millennia afterwards. Anecdotally, I can tell you there are thousands of nuraghe in Sardinia, and many of them are now used to keep pigs and sheep, okay, believe it or not. I also worked in Corsica, and that was also very illuminating, particularly in the south of Corsica. There, Filippo was very valuable because I couldn't understand the local dialect, but he could, coming from North Sardinia. And there are so many stories about my work in Corsica that I don't have time to tell. But there is one particular story which I think is very interesting that I want to tell you, is that one of the herders I interviewed had these pigs that you can see here. These pigs were kept in a very large enclosure. So they weren't quite free range, but the enclosure was large enough to keep them relatively free. But the herder told me, yeah, but I don't just have these pigs, I also have some other pigs, okay? And from where he lived in this farm near village, he pointed out, there, those pigs were there in those mountains, okay? This is the exact scene we were seeing from his farm, okay? And he said, my other pigs are there in the mountains. And that was June, and I asked him, I said, I would love to go and see these pigs. When are you going next? And then he said, you're very welcome. I'm going next time in September. I mean, that just gives you an idea what free range means. You know, these animals are just completely independent. The labor required is very, very minimal, okay? Going back to Sardinia just for a second, there is another phenomenon which is so interesting that I have to tell you. It's just a pig story I can't keep for myself because I'm so excited about that. Is what I found out also through my interviews with the herders is that there is pig transhumans. Okay. Now, transhumans is a concept that is mainly associated with sheep and cattle, possibly goat. Basically, what is transhumans? It's moving livestock from one pasture to the other seasonally in order to make the most of different pastures in different seasons. Typically, you go up in the mountains in the summer. Okay, this is transhumans, but in a very different way. Okay, and what happened here is that during the winter, the autumn and the winter, the pigs are there in the mountains. Okay. And they are there because the best possible food for the pigs is in the forest, is massed from the forest, especially acorns, in the late autumn and early winter. But the bad season, the difficult season for pigs is the summer. So people would actually move with the pigs in the plains in the summer where it would be very hot. Why would they go to the plains? This is farmland there. And after the harvest, the pigs would actually feed on the stubble from the harvest. Okay, which I thought here there are it's a big distance that we are talking about. So these people were moving with the pigs, really big distance. And I was lucky to find in the photographic historical archive in Sardinia actually a photograph of the pigs feeding on the stubble. You won't see this anymore nowadays for a reason that I will explain in a second. This photograph that you see here is a bad photograph because it's taken from a book, it's from the 30s, but it's the most exciting photograph for me because it's the only photograph I know, I'm aware of pig transhumans. Okay, and we know that pig transhumans also happened in the Middle Ages in France and Spain, but here you see pigs going to this town. Okay, so that's quite remarkable. Unfortunately, the original is lost. It was lost in a fire, and the person who took that photograph is this man, Maurice Lelanoux, one of my big heroes. He was a French geographer. This is his book, Shepherds and Peasants of Sardinia. It's the Italian translation, but the original is in French. And Lelanoux, during the fascist period in Italy, on his motorbike, was traveling all over Sardinia and reporting about the life of peasants and shepherds. And this book is just one of my Bibles, okay? It just tells you so many amazing stories, including describing that the transhumans I was telling you about. Now, you will normally associate transhumans with pigs, and that is something that we have to take into account in archaeology interpretation. Pigs can move around. One thing I should say that this world I have described is partly gone. Okay, there's no pig transhumans anymore, and partly is still there, but rapidly disappearing. Why is it rapidly disappearing? Well, bear in mind that this way of keeping animals is very environmentally sustainable and also produces products of absolute top quality, okay? And also healthy for the people doing it, okay? But it's the interest of big business that is pushing this out, okay? Big business wants to have these fat pigs from the factory farms, from the lagers, okay, and sell meat to the Sardinians. So, for instance, now transhumans is forbidden because the excuse is because to avoid spread of disease, okay? So, if they have to move animals, rather than walking them through the countryside, they stuck them on a lorry in very high density, and they think this is healthier. I mean, this is just crazy, but you know, this is in the interest, the economic interest. And for me, this is very interesting because this work there it just tells us something about how the world goes. You know, it's the interest of big business there is pushing out something that we desperately need now, which is something environmentally sustainable. It just reminds me of what happens all the time around us. And, you know, we were talking about situations in universities, for instance. Universities would get rid of people, close departments, just because we are not in line with the project grid, basically. It's absolutely the same phenomenon. Back to the archaeology. One of the things, I really, for the first year of my career, so I was very much a prehistorian, okay? But when I was in Naples, I gradually got involved also with the world of classical archaeology and started studying Roman pigs, which I found incredibly interesting. And one of the things that was interesting for me studying, especially I started studying material from sites in Naples, and the amount of pigs that you find in Roman sites in Italy is unbelievable, especially in the Roman imperial period, so in the later times, and also in the early medieval period. Okay, 70 or 80% of the bones you find are from pigs. Okay, this fits well also with the work, with the words, I should say, or some of the written sources. And there you say the famous cookery book by Apicius from Roman times. Most of the meat recipes are based on pork. Okay, so we know that the Romans were very keen on pork. This is for a number of reasons. Of course, Apicius' book was mainly for the upper class, but we find all these pig bones also in sites of lower status. One thing that, having worked in different areas in Europe, and also obviously a lot, especially in Britain, that I have found very interesting is how this characteristic of Roman life never really made its way outside of southern and central Italy. Okay, so it tells us a lot about cultural transmission. I would work. Of course, the Romans were influencing things all over. But the kind of is we should be careful not to simplify this as a kind of core. People talk of a core periphery system. It's not just so that there is the core; everything was exported elsewhere. Okay, and so basically in Britain, for instance, in Roman times, we never had this predominance of pig, and it's something that I found fascinating. Again, acknowledging people, as a prehistorian, as also a natural scientist at heart, it was my cousin Maria Laura Raimondi in Naples that actually introduced me to the world of classical and historical archaeology. She was an archaeologist there, and that opened new horizons for me. In those early years in Italy, also another person who was a bit of an influence for me was Graham Barker. He came from Sheffield, actually. He was a lecturer in Sheffield here. But at the time, he was the director of the British School at Rome. We met. He gave me very useful advice. And we have remained good friends ever since. And yeah, so Graham has been a good thing for my career. I wanted to jump ahead. Sorry, these devices are not very good for Italians who gesticulate all the time. One of the things I just wanted to mention is the work that I did on pigs, not just Roman pigs, but pigs from Rome. And this happened quite a few years later, but I mention it now. This was facilitated by my great friends Claudia Miniti and Jacopo De Grosso, with whom I have collaborated on many things. And they made this amazing material available to me, and in particular from this remarkable early medieval site of the Crypta Balbi. One thing that was interesting at the time was to look at the size of the pigs, because I was still going on with this question, trying to figure out how size and shape are associated with the types of pigs we have. Are they domestic pigs, wild boar, something else, feral pigs, hybrids, or whatever? So there was a number of comparisons. Now, Angela is here, provided the data from the Etruscan site of Forcello here. Okay, this histogram shows the overall size of these pigs. And Angelo did her PhD here in Sheffield with me on the material from Forcello and coming up with all kinds of interesting things. But what it was interesting is that in the second diagram here, you see these are Roman pigs. And you can see they are just the same size as the Etruscan one. So there is no kind of size improvement in Roman time. And that is actually well known. The Romans were keen on pigs, but there are reasons why they were not improving them. Because the Romans needed the mobility of the pigs. Because the Romans kept the pigs in the countryside, and then they moved them big distances towards the big urban centers. Okay, but then we move to the crypta bulbi early medieval material, and then you see that there is a clear increase in size, and then the size becomes smaller. You can see in this distribution also a tail, a large tail here and there, and these are probably wild boar. But you will notice that in this group here, because the domestic pigs are bigger, the tail is not quite as clear as you see here or here. There's no tail at all in the Roman period. Okay, what is my interpretation of this increase in size? I'm pretty sure that what's happening here is that the domestic pigs are interbreeding with wild boar. And wild boar are larger than domestic pigs, and this is why they're getting bigger. Why is this interesting? I think the reason why it's interesting is because from the pigs, I should move, I should stay there. That's the sort of thing I was afraid I would start meandering around the room. Anyway, the reason why this is interesting is because how we can move from an understanding of the pigs to an understanding of the topography of the city. Because I think that what was happening there is that in the city, and especially in the period a little bit in between these two reconstructions that you can see here, the city was really becoming much more ruralized. The density of population was becoming lower after the end of the Roman period, and that more rural area was attracting the possibility for wild boar entering the city and meeting it with probably free-range domestic pigs. And I'm pretty sure that this is what is happening there. So it's interesting for me to see the link between the animals and the overall topography of the place. As Caroline said before, in 1991, for the first time, I moved to London. Okay, I had a fellowship called given by the Association for Cultural Exchange, which sounded a little bit like help to the third world. And because it was mainly addressed for people coming from Southern Europe, but I'm ever so grateful to them. I never met anybody who was from that association, but it was based at the Institute of Archaeology in London, and that was for me a big, big change in my career. When I moved there, I enjoyed staying at the Institute, but the man I really wanted to meet was Sebastian Payne, who is here, because Sebastian had written a very important paper that all my students know all about it, because I always give them this paper to my students on the distinction of wild boar and domestic pigs, and I had been applying this methodology intensively. So when in London, I went to see Sebastian work at the English Heritage, and he was very much kind of enthusiastic about what I was doing, and we started the project together. And Sebastian told me, look, to do further methodological work on this, I do know a site that has a huge amount of bones of pigs, and we should really analyze this in some detail. That site was Darrington Walls, that eventually has played a big role in my life. It still does. I still have Darrington Walls work to do. The other person I met at the time was Simon Davis, who was also working at the English Heritage. Simon has been a big part of my life too. We have collaborated on endless projects, and he's also one of my best. He also became one of my best friends. And talking of best friends, the other person I met that year was Dale Sargentson, another renowned archaeologist. At the time, Dale was doing some work at the Institute of Archaeology, and this is where we met. And this photograph you see here is actually a photograph of only 3 years ago, because we organized a conference in her honor here, which was very successful. You see there, there with my team and also the other conference organizers. And it was very nice that these two friends I met such a long time ago, in the last 12 months, we published 2 books in their honor. These are the proceedings of the conference I was talking about in their honor. And this is a book we recently published for Simon. Okay, so that has given me a great amount of pleasure, satisfaction. Now, back to Darrington Walls. What is Darrington Walls? It's late Neolithic monuments. It's what is called a henge. Okay, it's basically the traditional interpretation. Is what people would possibly describe as a ceremonial enclosure that you see here. One of the reasons, and I'm not sure it's necessarily a good reason, but it is one of the reasons why Darrington Walls is quite famous, is because it's close to the super famous site of Stonehenge. And more and more now that in the last few years that we have analyzed Stonehenge mainly in its setting, in its landscape, we are pretty convinced that the two monuments are associated, that they are related, okay? When I worked on material with Darrington Walls, Sebastian and I were mainly interested in a kind of opportunistic use of Darrington Walls. We wanted to look at those bones because we were interested in their methodological potential. But Dale was interested in what I was doing too, persuaded me that he was also interested to look at the bones in order to understand more of the site in itself. Okay, and this is what we did, and we came up with all kinds of interesting stories, which I can't tell you now because it would take too long. But just to say, just very briefly, one of the patterns that was quite remarkable we found on the bones, and we found this in these 2 pig astragala, which are the kind of bones from the pig hind leg, are these patterns of burning that you see here. You see this black is burning, and they are so very regular, which we understood that they were associated with regular patterns of roasting. Okay, and the scenario we were reconstructing is basically large chunks of pig carcasses roasted on fires, and there are plenty of hearts discovered at Darrington Walls. And on a regular basis, a lot of meat consumed in a relatively short time by big gatherings of people, basically feasting. Okay, this is what was going on there. Another interesting anecdote and interesting story associated with this is, can you see this bone here? We found a number of bones that had flints embedded into them. And this particular bone, which is a big humerus, has the tip of an arrowhead embedded in it. Okay, this is was very interesting. For the main reason why I was very interested, because through the biometrical work that Sebastian and I were doing, we actually knew for sure that this was a domestic pig. So what the hell were they doing hunting domestic pigs? That will probably remain a mystery forever, but it reminded me of an interview I had with another Corsican herder. I remember talking to this guy, and he had this little farm surrounded by some hills, very wooded hills. And I went to talk to him, and we were there, and I knew he was a pig herder. And he said at some point, well, do you want to see my pigs? And I said, yes, absolutely, I would love to see your pigs. And he whistled, okay? And then we were surrounded by this woodland. You could see nothing. And within 10 seconds, hordes of pigs came from the woodland, and they all came to us because they knew the whistle meant food, okay? What is interesting, you might think, oh, these were rather docile pigs, responding to the herder's whistle straight away. He couldn't get anywhere close to them. These were really pretty wild, not in the strict sense. And what he told me, that when he needed meat from one of them, he would shoot them. this is what he would do, because that it was much easier than try to catch them. Okay, and so when I saw this, it reminded me of the Corsica had. I'm not saying it's the same thing happened, but you know, these connections can be interesting. I mean, obviously, Darrington was a ritual site. Karen said it's not only a ritual site. There's a domestic element to it, but it has a ritual element to it. But Karen said one of the things I have investigated is actually the ritual element. When after my early 91, I actually did go back to Italy for a while, and Karen mentioned that I taught at the University of Lecce in southern Italy for a while. That gave me the opportunity to study the material from this quite remarkable sanctuary of Monte Papalucio, which is regarded as a kind of a native sanctuary with strong Greek influence. It's in this reconstruction, it was in this cave. Okay, this is mainly regarded as a 6th, 5th century in one phase, and then 4th with something in the middle doesn't have much. So it's kind of archaic time and then Hellenistic times. This is another reconstruction. The abundance of material from this site is unbelievable. Miniature pots, obviously, of ritualistic use, figurines. There is absolutely no question about the ritual use of this site. But also lots of bones, and which I studied. And if you look at the proportions of the main domesticates, you can see that in both phases, pigs, which are here, are totally predominant. And the other thing that was interesting, most of those pigs are very, very young, okay, really piglets. If you are keeping pigs for pure economic reasons, you don't kill them as young as that. That's not an efficient way to breed the animals. These piglets obviously were sacrificed for ritual use, and the kind of religious connection is very obvious, because we know that the goddess Demeter, the goddess, the Greek goddess of the harvest, is traditionally associated with pigs. And even a figurine of Demeter was found at the site. So it's not just the pigs that told us this story, but it was very clear this was a Demeter sanctuary with lots of pig bones, young pig bones. And also we know from the classical iconographic tradition that actually young pigs would typically be sacrificed. Moving on to another pig story, and this is Mycenaean Greece. After London, returning from Italy, I worked in London further, and then I moved to Birmingham, as Karen said before. And while I was in Birmingham, I mainly worked on British material. But my colleague Ken Wardle, who worked in Greece, actually suggested that I would do some work at Mycenaean Greece. You don't say no to Mycenaean so easily. You know, it's one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the world. And for me, this was probably, well, I could put it with my Sardinian experience at the very top of my archaeological experience. I was working on the animal bones there in the museum, and I remember the museum would close after the closure of the site to the tourists. So when I had finished working, I would have a wander about on Mycenae on my own, okay? And that is an experience that is for me unforgettable. Walking, walking across the Lion Gate and with nobody else around. I almost expected to see Agamemnon around the corner and something like that. Anyway, so it was a fantastic experience, but the archaeology in itself was remarkable. The bones came from the sacred area in Mycenae here, so this is also very much associated with ritual use. And just to give you some chronological points of reference, most of the material is 13th century BC. This is really the height of the Mycenaean period. It's what's called the late Hellenic 3B. Okay, so this is the period that basically is described by, it's supposed to be described by Homer and so on. Okay, famous period. The bones were in, I remember Ken told me how the bones are very fragmented. I'm not sure how much you're going to get from that. This was one of the most remarkable preservation I have ever seen in my life. Many of the bones were burnt, which is very typical of ritual sites. Incredible material, and there were lots of pigs, and most of the pigs were actually very young. And this is a pig, the shoulder blade of a piglet with cut marks here. Okay, so what was particularly interesting, before I move to the next thing, what was particularly interesting about this is that the burning and the use of the piglets were things which were very well known for ritual sites, but of a much later time. Okay, so we could see a potential connection between the Archaic and the Classical period and the Mycenaean period. And that was very interesting to see. Other people after me have done work and confirmed this connection. One thing that was very exciting for me, and again, going back to the pigs, but this is wild boar we're talking about, is can you see these fragments? Okay, these are fragments of wild boar tusks. Okay, and why are they cut in this particular way? Well, because they belong to helmets. Okay, the very famous wild boar tusk helmets that were worn by the Mycenaean warrior aristocracy. Okay, the one you see on the right is an archaeological specimen that coming from a grave. Okay, so this is why it's intact. But I was finding bits and pieces there. They are also known from the iconography. You can see that. You can probably just see the helmet with the bits of wild boar tusk there. And but they are famous because they are described by Homer. Okay, and for me, the possibility of being the first person to identify those pieces that had been on the heads of these famous warriors described in this kind of literature that belongs really to our past, to our culture, was incredibly exciting. I know it's rather anecdotal, but it's the kind of story I have to tell. Just moving on to a completely different story, moving back to my work in England and the work I did with Simon, the work I did at English Heritage, and then continued. I was also doing a lot of work on the medieval period, okay? And one thing that was interesting, looking at the size, here we were working on material from the site of Lonsdale Castle in southwest Britain, and it was interesting to see that moving from the to the mid-medieval, late medieval, and then early post-medieval, late post-medieval period, you see a gradual increase in the size of the bones. But the teeth would fluctuate, as you can see here. Okay, so bone increased steadily in size, teeth fluctuate. So there is basically a difference that we see in time in the shape of pigs. Post-medieval pigs had much larger bones, but not so much the teeth. What was going on? Well, basically what we are seeing here on the archaeological material is the transformation from something that, you know, the pigs come from the wild boar. We don't have wild boar there, but you move to something like this, domestic pig, which is very much wild boar-like, and this is a 14th century depiction from Britain, actually. And this is domestic pig, but obviously you can see that it doesn't look like the classic domestic pig we have in mind, with long snout, so not so much big bones, but a long snout with probably big teeth, to something like this, which is still slightly improved, but not so much, and then eventually, sorry, I'll get it right eventually, and to something like this. Obviously that is a caricature, but basically an animal with a very big body and a very short snout. Okay, so we are seeing the archaeology this change. Are we just focusing on the animals? No, we are focusing on what that means for the societies, because the perception of an animal that lives in the woodland and feeds in the woodland and has that kind of shape, long snout, wild boar-like, long hair, and so on, is very different from something that you can see here, which is still quite bucolic, nothing to do with the lagers we were talking about before, but still, very much different perception in the relationship between people and animals than the kind of more woodland-oriented domestic pigs I was telling you before, the kind of but free-range pigs. Okay, and this kind of situation and what it meant in terms of the perception, I have the perfect description here in the British literature, and from the wonderful Flora Thompson, a beautiful English writer from the late 19th century, early 20th century. And this is a passage that I have to read to you because I love it so much. And it just shows you how the perception of pigs have changed, how life has changed for people, from taking the pigs to the forest to having the pigs more embedded in village life. So what Flora Thompson writes here is, during his lifetime, the pig was an important member of the family, and its health and condition were regularly reported in letters to children away from home, together with news of their brothers and sisters. Men callers on Sunday afternoons came, not to see the family, but the pig, and would lunge with its owner against the pigsty door for an hour, scratching piggy's back and praising his points or turning up their noses in criticism. The family pig was everybody's pride and everybody's business. I think this is lovely. Okay, I did write a paper on the evolution of pigs from medieval to post-medieval times, which is published in this book. And the reason why I'm showing you this book is because this book is the product of a group that has played an important role in my career. Is the Diet Group that meets twice a year in Oxford. It's a group of historians and archaeologists talking together about the medieval period. Dale Sargent is the person who introduced me to this group in the 90s. So now I'm still go, we haven't met much because of COVID, but the group is still existing and active. And another person I met through the Diet group, actually I didn't meet him there, but he's certainly an active member of the Diet group, is Chris Dyer. Chris Dyer was my colleague in Birmingham. He's an eminent medieval historian. When we were both in Birmingham, I remember we would go for lunch sometimes and have amazing conversations. We wouldn't discuss university policies, we wouldn't discuss jobs, we wouldn't discuss administration, we just discussed about medieval life. It was wonderful. Okay, nowadays, how many academics do that? Not very often. So that was absolutely wonderful. Chris has been a great inspiration for me and a great supporter, and we're still very good friends and very much in touch. Now, you have to plant seeds for the future. So my work on the kind of transition from the Middle Ages to post-medieval periods and also pigs, also under animals, has been picked up by my former students, now experienced researchers. So you see a couple of examples there from Idoia Grau and Lenny Salvagno, people who are now work elsewhere, Idoia in Basel and Lenny in Munich, but still very much attached to our team. I eventually moved to Durham after Birmingham to work on this project that Karen mentioned on pig domestication and husbandry. And I worked with Peter Rowley-Conway, who has also been another great friend for me and great supporter over the years. And this paper there, I think it was an important paper for me, because in this paper, focusing on Italy, but not on Roman pigs, not on archaic or classical pigs, but rather early Neolithic pigs, we, I think, demonstrated that the domestication, okay, at the beginning of the farming, is a very complex phenomenon, and actually it can be simplified as an introduction from elsewhere or a local domestication. but the two things, they are kind of interconnected, okay? And in particular in Italy, I think we have strong evidence that there was an element of local domestication that people, maybe in the past didn't believe so much. I still believe in it, there's still a debate going on. But again, you have to plant seeds for the future. And Angelos Lycia actually worked on a similar project, but based in Spain for his PhD. And actually, I'm a bit envious of Angelos because I think his results are even more interesting. Because Angelos managed to find sites that seem to be associated more with the local tradition and other sites that seem to be associated more with the introduced tradition, which was very interesting to see. Then I had Sarah Viner, who did another PhD with me based in Britain, and in Britain, again, a different scenario. It seems both cattle and pig, they are mainly introduced. But perhaps most important of all, Sofia Tece, another PhD, went back to Italy because about the Italian situation was a bit controversial. And I was always worried about the fact that we probably needed more data, we needed bigger sample. And for me, it was great that Sofia did do that. She added many more sites and more geographic regions and more periods to my analysis, and basically my early results were widely confirmed, which I was relieved to realize that. Okay, so then came Sheffield. Okay, the man who brought me to Sheffield is here, and it's a great pleasure that he's here. It was John Barrett. I really owe it to John that eventually I'm here. Also, my project in Durham was coming to an end. Like now, I was facing unemployment, and but John and I had met at a number of conferences, and we had had a number of interesting conversations. And it seems to me that conversation has never ended, even now. And I think, I don't know if John would agree with that, but we both like a good academic debate. And quite often we disagree, but we always like engaging in that. And John has just been such a rock for me, especially in those early years. And I will always be grateful to him for bringing me to Sheffield, but also for believing in the work I was doing. So thank you. When I came here, obviously having done the work at Darrington Walls, my bucket list was here at the time was excavating again at Darrington. Obviously, he was very interested in the possibility of me coming here. One of the things that had really interested Mike for the sort of thinking he had at the time is that in my early work, I had pointed out that I thought that most of those pigs were born in winter, okay? And with the potential association of Darrington Walls' Stonehenge, and obviously the monuments mainly associated with the summer solstice, that's something that really excited Mike a lot. We published a bit of a preliminary paper on that, and that was really picked up by the media hugely, okay? And the media typically came up with all kinds of silly stories. And this is the Daily Telegraph here, saying Stonehenge Druids mark wrong solstice, and there were lots of papers like that, and this was all based on my preliminary work on those pigs. But there is a God out there, so what they did, they misspelled my name, and they called me Umberto Albarella, who became a celebrity at the time. And so if you do a Google search for Umberto Albarella, you will find all kinds of connections to this silly story. So I was shielded by my colleague Umberto Albarella from all this silliness. But we decided to go a little bit more serious on that. And, we were using the new excavation Darrington Walls, lots of more material. We went back to the question of the season of birth, and I had a very good master student called Lizzie Wright, who you may have heard of, and very young at the time, still younger, but not quite as young as she used to be. And we looked again with great detail. We came up even with a new methodology. And fortunately, the work of Umberto Albarella was confirmed, and actually we could actually confirm that we thought that there was this peak in the winter. And that was important, obviously, for the overall interpretation. The other part of my work at Darrington was, which has had quite a lot of exposure also in the media and so on, a little bit too much for my taste, is basically associated with mobility. Okay, so who was going into that Stonehenge landscape? You know, who was going to those feasts we had kind of demonstrated were going? Well, this is where the isotopic work came into place. And in particular, working with Jane Evans, who has been a very important collaborator for me for now many years. We've had many different projects together, but this was one of them. And basically, we were initially working on cattle rather than pig, and working on strontium isotopes. What strontium isotopes tell us is what is the geology of the area where animals were pasturing when their teeth were formed, okay? So we could associate animals to some specific geographic origin. It's not so specific, but we can get some idea. We are lucky about the fact that the Darrington Walls, which is here, is on chalk, and that chalk has a rather distinctive strontium signature, which is what you see in this band here, okay? So basically, now this is a very long and complex story, but just to sum up, you can see from all these points, all these samples and analysis we did, that it looks like these animals were coming from all over the places. We can't be sure about the specific points, but what we know is that they came from a vast area. Obviously, for the interpretation of Stonehenge landscape, this was very important because we could realize that these large gatherings were not just local people, but obviously were people coming from big distances with their animals, okay, with their animals. Now people would say, well, they are bringing cattle, but they could bring pigs, because they are not mobile enough. But I knew one or two things they didn't know. So, spearheaded by my colleague Richard Madwick in Cardiff, great colleague who we included in this project, and I'm very fond of him and his work, and we worked very well together. We also did similar work with pigs, and we came up with similar conclusion. The pigs too were coming from long distances. Then some people will say, that's not possible because the pigs are not mobile. Hey, but they didn't know about the Leila Nu and the pig transhumans, okay? So, and also they didn't know about Roman times when the pigs moved very long distance. So it's perfectly possible that pigs, like cattle, were moved from long distances. This has been important work because it has helped us to understand the dynamics of how the Stonehenge landscape worked. I want to finish my research part here, just to mention one thing that people always associate with pigs. Well, obviously it's well known that many cultures will stay away from pig meat. Obviously Jewish culture and Muslim culture. I mean, I didn't work myself on these things because of the geographic areas I worked on. But you know, my former student, Mick Lisowski, who's here, has worked on Jewish issues, but he was mainly focusing on butchery practices. But Veronica Anicetti worked in Sicily, and especially looking at the Islamic period in Sicily. And what is interesting in Veronica's work is that basically when she was comparing urban sites and rural sites, while in the Islamic urban sites, as you would expect, pig is either absent or rare, is actually quite common in the rural sites. So what's going on there, and one possible interpretation is basically the rules, the religious rules, were not so strict in the countryside as they were in the city. And I thought this was an interesting aspect. Here you can see a happy Veronica on the day of her arrival, just before COVID. These were times when we could still hug each other. I'm afraid that's no longer the case. Okay, finally, we moved quite a long way from the issue of social justice. But I just want to mention this, that all this research I have done has always been informed by my concern for justice, global, social, all levels. And I have said what pigs symbolize for me. But there has been one other part of my work that doesn't specifically deal with pigs, but deals with my conviction that archaeologists don't just need to be ethically informed, but they need to be politically informed. And one of the areas that really got me involved a lot was the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq is important for archaeologists because many archaeologists worked in Iraq, embedded with the military invading the country. Okay, in two areas, one was the forensic area and the other was the protection of the monuments. In themselves, very good things to do, very noble things to do. But it does bring a big dilemma. I'm working, however, under the protection of an invading army. Would you feel equally comfortable if that army was led by Hitler or somebody like that? Okay, so there's always a question to be asked. I wrote a paper in which I argued that archaeologists should actually question whether it is politically acceptable for them to work in particular context. And that is just one of the many aspects of the social justice that I'm interested in. But I'll come back to this in a minute, but I know I'm probably running out of time, big times, but I just need to provide some final thanks. Okay, one person I haven't acknowledged enough is this lady here, Karen Jackson. If I am a professor today, it's due to her. Because the way I am, I never asked, and then pushed for a chair. Karen can confirm it here. I would have never done. But it was Caroline who said you have to go for promotion, and she pushed hard for that. And she convinced me that I had a case. She had to convince me. And she was absolutely wonderful in doing that. But there is more to Caroline that I want to say. She has been our head of the department for 3.5 years, and she has been a great hand, okay? There are some people who believe that in order to be a good leader, you have to be a bit of a bully, okay? That's not Caroline. Caroline would talk to people and would try to find consensus. She also would try to understand the people. This is what leadership, real leadership means. And I think that some people should listen to this. There are a number of organizations that have been very important in my life. I mentioned some of them. One is the International Council of Archaeology. It's this amazing network of zooarchaeologists around the world, inspired by a concept, by a sense of solidarity, really, working together across national borders. Okay, borders is that word which I really dislike. I'm totally for no borders. And the International Council of Archaeology, I like to interpret it as an organization that has no borders. At the moment, also other great thing, it's great for women power. The president is a woman, the outgoing secretary is a woman, the incoming secretary who is here is a woman, and the treasurer is a woman. So that's great to pay attention to. My union, the Sheffield University College Union, has kept me sane in Sheffield. Sometimes I would go to these meetings in the university and I would go crazy to hear all the corporate language. But with the union, I would find a language of solidarity, okay? And so that has played a very important role for me, and it still does, okay? And I think if everybody is listening now, if you're not a trade unionist, if you want to do a good thing tomorrow, become a union member. We need it. We need to protect our work, and not just our job, but the conditions of our work. And you can find that solidarity within unions. But that's my most important slide of my talk. these are the people I have mentored or supervised or trained over the years. As I said there, the stories of these people have made my life, really. And I don't want to say what I have done for them now, but what they have done for me. I have learned so much from these people in many different respects. I have learned academically, but I have learned many life lessons. And really, they motivated me so immensely. And sorry, I feel very emotional. Let's look at this. These are the names. I think I want, because this is going to be recorded, I want the names to be there. Lots of these, some of these people I trained and I mentored before coming to Sheffield, but most of them belong to Sheffield. During all this controversy these last few weeks, one person, one colleague from America, talking about our team, described it as the legendary Sheffield team. That was a very nice touch, very nice thing to say. I mean, when I came to Sheffield, I had a dream, and the dream was to create a team that was based on mutual aid. Okay, that was my political inspiration. I never wanted to make it political for them, but it was political in my mind because I had my political inspiration and I know what mutual aid means ideologically for me. And one thing that also has inspired me, and I think some of them, is also the concept of participatory democracy and also the citizen assemblies that seem to become more popular as a way to make decisions. Basically, we sit down together and we make decisions together. We work together. We've done so many wonderful things together. And it only requires a feeling of cultural vandalism, and this is what we've discussed, to want to destroy this. But this is what is going to happen. This is what this university is going to do, is destroy this legendary team. Okay? Cultural vandalism is an expression I have used before and I will use again. I have to thank, finally, my big hero. So I have written a little ode to him. Or him or her, I should say. Dear Pig, many thanks for being my hero, inspiration and example, for teaching me that playing in the mud is more important than any executive meeting, for teaching me that corporate language is meaningless once you've had a good look at the sky, for teaching me that grey people in suits will never succeed in destroying our joyful life. Just want to finish just paying tribute to my daughter and her sense of design. So this was made by her. Thank you very much.
Would you accept questions?
Of course.
Good. It says, could you expand on why people might choose pig transhumans over cattle or sheep? Do you have a view why pig husbandry was prevalent on Sardinia and Corsica, but less common elsewhere?
Okay, in terms of the first question, you know, I don't think that people choose to do pig transhumans rather than cattle or sheep transhumans. But you have some people who do both, okay? And also there are some people who are specialists in the type of animals that they have, okay? So they would eventually trade with, let's say the pig herders would trade with the cattle herders or with the sheep herders, okay? So you have a combination of different potential situations. In terms of the predominance of pig husbandry, no, pig husbandry is not predominant in Sardinia. I may have given that impression because I have focused on pigs in my study. In fact, probably the most important animal in Sardinia is sheep, is rather than pig. And but you know, there are so many different conditions why some animals may be favored rather than others. It depends on environmental conditions, cultural backgrounds. It's very difficult to summarize.
Thank you. The next comment is, "We love you dearly, Umberto."
Thank you. Well, what can I say?
I think that's. Does anybody else have any questions? You can shout them out if you've got them in the audience, or put them on Menti if you're online. Any other comments you want me to read out? I'll just shout out.
Umberto, the Corsican pigs living in the mountains that only had a visit or two a year.
Yes.
I mean, not biologically speaking, but are they wild or domesticated? How do you talk about these issues in your?
It is a very interesting question. I have wondered about this myself, because I think the concept of wild and domestic is different whether you approach it as a biological phenomenon or an anthropological one. And I can tell you, anthropologically, they are domestic. And I think for a number of reasons. One of them is that these pigs, although they spend so much of the year alone, they recognize the herder. So when the herder goes there and calls them, they respond. Okay, and I think, and also, you know what is the most important thing is that the herder interprets them as being domestic, as he speaks. I think anthropologically that's enough to make them domestic. But yeah, absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's a very good question, because it just shows that these categories are variable according to our viewpoint. Yeah.
Can I ask?
Sure.
What about when they have piglets? Are they part of the herder's flock, or whatever you call pigs?
The piglets stay with the mothers for a good amount of time. So these pigs, obviously, they would give birth to piglets in nature. I have also seen quite a few natural shelters where they actually go, and they would stay with the herd. You know, they are relatively social animals, so they would stay with the herd. I think the animals that tend at some point to disappear are the adult males. Okay, this is when at some point the herder may intervene and either castrate them or kill them.
One more question here. It says, "Thank you so much, Umberto. You're truly an inspiration. Do you find being an academic an advantage in your work for social justice?"
It's a difficult question, but I think that the answer is yes. I think for a number of reasons is that you know, being an academic gives you a certain status, which means that you know, people will hear your voice a little bit more. And also, being an academic is not just a status thing. It also means that you are part of a community. And for me, social justice is something that belongs to everyday's life. We interact with your students, with your colleagues, and so on. If you are a lone researcher who's writing a book in your office at home, obviously your opportunities are more limited. So the short answer, I think, is yes.
Another question. Do you know if the real free range breeding and transhumans from 19th and 20th century Sardinia is still practiced anywhere else in the world today? And that's from my
Yes, I think it is, although it's in many different versions, let's put it in this way. But there are certainly areas where it still happens. I mean, there are for instance, I know there are places in northern India where transhumans is practiced. Of course, the most famous case that is worldwide famous in the anthropological literature is Papua New Guinea. Okay, but there are, even in the Balkans, there are areas where there are elements of that. Okay, to what extent you can define it as kind of pure free range or not is open to debate.
Questions?
I think Mick had a question.
But thank you for this lecture. It was brilliant, and I don't want to ask again about the white feral pigs, but I will. And so, how did they find the pigs when they were roaming for half a year in the mountains? And because there were no enclosures, right? So how did the farmer find his pigs and know how to distinguish them from other pigs, from his neighbor? And what was the connection of the farmer with the pigs? Were they names, or were they like parts of the family? Not really. Like were they just animals or something else? And then a question. No, that's it.
I think the herder knows where the pigs live. Obviously, if the pigs live in those conditions, the herder knows that from time to time he will lose the odd pig, either because they wander about, to other places, as I said, especially the males, the mature males, or because they succumb to predation. Okay. But pigs tend to live in relatively restricted areas, so they wouldn't move to completely different area. They would tend to stay in that kind of area, and the herder will know where they are. How does he recognize them from others? He knows them all. He knows all of them one by one, as you would know a family member, just like that. He knows them one by one. And in fact, maybe for those, because they live in rather remote areas, it's slightly less difficult. But in some of the Sardinian plateaus I showed you, there can be quite a crowd of animals, all different kinds. And I did wonder, well, but these are all animals in communal land belonging to different people. And I asked, how do you recognize them? And that was a question to which I always had the same answer. Without any doubt, everybody said, it's not a problem at all. We know our pigs. They know all of them one by one perfectly well. So they recognize them.
Thank you.
One final comment here. It says, an amazing talk. I don't think I've been able to remain so concentrated for nearly 2 hours straight, so there we go. So I think on that point, unless anybody's got any further questions, I'd like to thank Umberto very, very much for a wonderful inaugural lecture.
Thank you.
Just wait a few moments, please. Umberto, do you want to sit down?